Well, welcome to this webinar series with AALS and West Academic on artificial intelligence and legal education. We're really pleased to be bringing the Academy this webinar series. It's been highly attended. I think 1,000 people watched the first two, and then I know many people that couldn't make it in real time. We're going to watch the recordings, which are available. So this topic of artificial intelligence in legal education has clearly struck a need where many people are trying to figure out, what are the latest policies, the technologies available, responsible use, so many of the issues that are coming at all of us. And so ALS is really pleased to partner with West Academic on this webinar series to open up some of these discussions for the Legal Academy. You will see later in the webinar that we will post a form so that you can give us some input on other topics that you'd like to see. We do plan, because of the welcome reception this has had, to continue this series. And so we want your input. What is it that you'd like to hear about? And we'll do our best to be responsive. We have a number of our sections that are focused on law and technology issues. And so I know many of you that are tuned in are familiar with us and know that our sections cover almost every area. But please also know that I'm always eager to hear ways that ALS can support the Legal Academy. We care deeply about supporting all of the deans, the faculty, the staff, administrators of our law schools. And so we're always here to be of service and to help. In that spirit, I want to give a big shout out today to Professor Kat Moon from Vanderbilt, who's leading this, and to all the speakers that she'll feature. Kat and I had fun with a podcast that she hosted recently called Talk Justice. So it's wonderful that you were bringing that same energy that I enjoyed our discussion so much to this webinar today, Kat. Thanks so much. And before we turn it to Kat, I also want to introduce and thank Pam Chandler from West Academic. Pam is a terrific partner, and West has been wonderful to work with in bringing this series forward. So, Pam, with that, it's all yours, and know of my deep thanks and appreciation.
Thank you, Kelly, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pam Chandler, and I lead the team here at West Academic. And before we bring on the panel, I just want to share a few quick thank yous. First, to our fantastic panelists, both the all-star team you're hearing from today and also the panelists you've heard from in our prior webinars, for so generously sharing their expertise, both in the webinars themselves and, of course, in all of the work that goes into planning for each session, especially in an area like AI with new things to talk about every day. We know the lift is not small, and we so appreciate all of your time and generosity in sharing all of your expertise with us. Thank you also to AALS for being such wonderful partners in this work. I think most of you probably know Kelly and her team are just extraordinary, and we feel so lucky to have a front row seat to all they bring to the Academy and to legal education. And of course, to all of you, as Kelly mentioned, we have been so encouraged by the response to this series and so inspired by what we're learning from this community. So much so that even though we're pausing the series over the summer while we focus on some research we're doing with AALS, we look forward to more programming, hearing what you want to hear from us, and then, of course, also sharing our research with you in the next academic year. So with that, I am delighted to turn things over to Professor Kat Moon from Vanderbilt Law School, who will lead today's discussion. Take it away, Kat.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Pam. It is wonderful to be here. And I'm not alone. I have three amazing panelists who are going to join me for this rousing conversation about AI policies in law schools. So I would love to take a moment to just go around the panel and ask you all to introduce yourself before we jump into the conversation. We'll just go in alpha order, starting by first name. So Emily, you go.
Hi, thanks, Kat. I'm Emily Janowski Halen. I am the Dean at the University of Akron School of Law, but I'm also a law librarian, so I have a unique perspective on being a dean and being a law librarian.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. And Nancy, now to you.
Thanks. Nancy Rappaport. I'm at the William S. Boyd School of Law at UNLV.
Fantastic. And William, the mic is now yours.
Thank you. I'm William Hubbard. I'm at the University of Chicago Law School.
Fantastic. All right. Emily, Nancy, and William, we have a lot of ground to cover. And so I'm just going to jump right in. I will introduce myself briefly. Kat Moon, I'm professor of the practice at Vanderbilt, also a practicing lawyer for nearly 30 years now, and I'm co-director of the Vanderbilt AI Law Lab, which has been in place, will be 3 years in November. So time is flying. I'm going to give just a brief kind of introduction to frame our conversation, introduce a little bit of data, and then let's see where this goes. So past couple of years, generative AI has gone from something that's kind of, oh, that's interesting, right? To like just kind of being part of everything everywhere all at once, right? Um, Gonna cite a little bit of data for you. So according to Clio's latest legal trends report, 79% of legal professionals report now using AI in their work. A little bit of higher ed data, 92% of higher ed students, and this includes our incoming 1Ls, right, are self-reporting that they are using AI tools. And with this, we are working in and teaching students in institutions that move slowly and deliberatively, right? So it's an interesting combination here. So where does legal education sit in all of this? So we have a little bit of data. So the ABA Task Force on Law and AI released a year two report in December of last year. These numbers, 55% of responding law schools offer AI focused courses. That can go in a couple of different ways, though. There's the AI of law and then the law of AI, right? Two different focus areas. 83% are reporting experiential opportunities in clinics, labs, simulations, and 69% are reporting having updated their academic integrity policies to deal with AI. So this all sounds like progress, right? And I think in some ways it is, but there are a couple of caveats worth flagging that, the sample is a small number of schools, self-selected, and probably the ones who are most engaged, right? So there's that. And if we look at a Kaplan 24 survey of 97 schools, it found that 54% had no AI policy at all when it came to admissions essays, which is a whole other kind of area to consider, right? So there are all these ways to look at this, but let's move from looking at the policy atmosphere to the training gap. Um, so, because this is where I think a lot of tension lies, and it's not an area that really I see a lot of conversation happening. So, per Reuters reporting in mid 25, only about 5% of law faculty teach generative AI in a dedicated standalone course, right? So, only 5% are involved really in teaching the technology in some meaningful way. And then per 2025 Global AI Faculty Survey, only 6% of faculty across higher ed feel that their institution is giving adequate training to faculty with respect to AI. And again, that's a general higher ed. There aren't any numbers for law school there. But so here's what I think is an interesting tension. We have AI policies being authored by faculty and administration who don't have training or experience in the thing we're talking about. So I think we need to name that. Kind of interesting. Um, at many schools, there is a default kind of no AI use policy. That's the case at my school. And we're going to dig into kind of how those policies shake out. And then it becomes really a classroom and course level policy issue, right? Decided by faculty. So this really shifts weight from institution to individual faculty member. And then we can look at, again, how prepared are those faculty members to be making good choices with respect to AI use and policy. I want to mention one final aspect of what I think is relevant, at least before we move into conversation, and that is where our students are going, right? We are training lawyers to go into practice for the most part. So law firms have been running an experiment with respect to AI. Some might say it's not going well. If we look at the number of instances in which lawyers have filed things with courts that have false statements in them with regard to cases and holdings and other things. Some refer to these as hallucinations. Um, so, a little bit of data about law firms and how they're handling AI use in the practice arena. According to, again, the Clio report, 44% of law firms are reporting that they have no AI governance policy at all. Then we look at just an overall knowledge workers report. that 78% of knowledge workers are bringing in their own tools, right? So shadow AI use. So even if an organization has a policy, folks still might be using whatever the heck they want to use. Um, and a lot of folks are using unauthorized tools. So this is a result of shadow AI. We know that lawyers face certain repercussions that other knowledge workers don't, and that's what we're preparing our students for. Okay, so kind of what's going on in schools with students out in the practice. I would say we're kind of at an inflection point. We are still in this place where we can make really good choices. But we have to make choices about how we're going to handle this. So let's talk about that. Let's get specific about what your institutions have done and are doing around AI use in the classroom, in the law school setting. We've all kind of shared policies with each other. We've had a chance to look at them. So let's talk about them. Let's share with the audience. Um, Emily, we'll start with you. And a couple of points I hope we can draw out is um, kind of how the policy came to be, faculty driven, dean driven, like where the impetus came from, and what's actually written down and where that's likely to happen. Again, there could be a school-wide or a law school-wide policy. Does it land in the faculty's purview? Um, and I think an interesting question to consider is, are there things that have been intentionally left open, whether for faculty or students, right? Like because that's another thing about all our policies is the detail varies greatly. So I think that's a really interesting part of this conversation. I'm now going to stop talking. Emily, the mic is yours.
Thanks, Kat. So we have a university policy, and we also have
Yep.
a school of law policy. And our school of law policy was faculty driven. So we had lots of discussions. We have 4 faculty members who teach in the area of AI. Our librarians are really well versed in AI and legal research and legal writing. And so they informed the discussion of what our AI policy should be. And while we want to encourage innovation and experimentation with technology, we also have that blanket, you shouldn't use it for your coursework, your assessments, your exams, and your academic work unless it is allowed at the individual level by the faculty member. So we have a policy in our academic handbook that defines generative AI and natural language outputs, and what is prohibited. But then we also have a caveat that if a faculty member wants you to use it, they'll specifically say that in their syllabus or in individual assignments. Because we do have faculty that are teaching it across the curriculum, using it in our civil procedure, which is a drafting civil procedure class, using it in legal writing, using it in legal research, obviously. And we have a Center for Intellectual Property and Technology that is teaching the law of AI and focusing on some of the intellectual property aspects of the AI world. So we've had a lot of discussions recently about academic dishonesty and proving AI use. That's been a huge issue as a dean writing discipline letters. And recently have been having a lot of discussions as a faculty, and we're going to bring in an outside party to talk to us about if the use of generative AI should be prohibited for things like formatting, right? And what is the distinction between substantive use of it and using it for formatting? So we've had quite a few discussions on our faculty. I think our faculty has done a great job of adopting a pretty broad policy, but also letting individual faculty members choose.
Okay, thank you. I know we're going to come back, so you're not off the hook yet, but we will shift to Nancy. Nancy, talk to us about what's going on at your school.
So the first thing our dean did was create a generative AI committee and asked me to chair it. And we had 2 charges, one of which we completed this year. The one that we completed this year was the student use policy. The charge for next year will be the faculty guidelines policy. And so I'll be touching the 3rd rail next year. But we have the same default rule. The same default rule is no AI for anything graded unless the faculty member allows it. We are requiring our faculty members to put their level of allowable AI in their syllabi so that students know from the get-go what is and is not allowed. We require our students to keep track of the AI that they use. But it took two faculty meetings to get it to a shape where the faculty was ready to vote on it. The first time we did a rules plus commentary structure for our guidelines, and as in every faculty meeting, people found holes in that. So then we took a month, patched the holes, and then the faculty adopted it. At the same time, enough of us who work in the AI area felt strongly enough that the faculty also approved a required first semester, first year responsible use of AI course that Joe Regalia and I will be teaching.
That is fantastic, I think. And we're going
Excited.
to talk more about that
Yeah,
piece of how we're preparing students. So I want to circle back around to
yeah.
that. So I'm glad you mentioned it. You also wrote a book. We'll touch on that in a
Thank
moment
you.
later. So, but
Which will be
William,
assigned, of course,
yeah,
in the class.
of course, of course. Um, all right, William, the mic is yours. Tell us about Chicago's policy.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so a lot of similarities is I think really the theme here in the conversation. We also have a policy on the student use of generative AI, and the framework is very similar to what Emily and Nancy said. Like Nancy, the dean formed a committee. I'm co-chairing the committee, and the first thing we did was put together a policy for student use, and so. And the same idea that the default is you can't submit for a grade anything that was created using generative AI. But if you're using it kind of on your own to help you study or prepare for class or quiz yourself or something like that, it's fine. Our AI committee really tries to bring together a lot of different perspectives from the faculty. We have clinical and non-clinical faculty. We have professors from practice and librarians. And so I think it's been really good. One of the things that we're also thinking about just on the kind of the process side of it, the committee is forming a student committee and forming an alumni committee to kind of advise us, tell us, okay, what's your experience? What would you like to see? Where do you see the problem points? And so we're working on that right now. The other thing that we're working on right now that I do want to mention is we may be revisiting the policy actually that we created this summer. Not to abandon it, but more to supplement it by something that goes beyond just a policy that's really focused on the question of academic integrity. And so, we can talk more about this as the conversation evolves. But I think there are a lot of questions about how do we want to structure our teaching? Does it make sense to coordinate across faculty members, across sections of the same course in terms of whether we're using technology or not using technology in the classroom? To what extent do we want to make sure we have classes where students are using AI, they're required to use AI? And how much do we want to make sure we have classes where students are forbidden from using any technology? It's really just them and the professor kind of, in the room mixing it up without any technology present. So those are the kinds of questions that we're beginning to try to confront in a more systematic way, because over the last couple of years, as I think all of us have expressed, really a lot of it's been up to the individual instructors to make judgments on their own. And I think that's a good way to start, but that's not necessarily where we want to end up either.
So many threads to pull from what all three of you shared. I'm going to jump into a couple of things that you said, William. So, with respect to the conversation more widely about technology use in the classroom, I'm seeing as well that this really is opening up more conversation about that. And we had a little bit of conversation before this webinar about having a no tech policy in the classroom, right? And how students are seeming to be a little more amenable to that, which is interesting, right? Kind of as the tech sort of invades all our spaces, that maybe carving out a space that is tech free for an hour of conversation um, really is something everyone's craving a little bit. I'm seeing a little bit of that as well. Um, I'm curious if any of you are, oh, the other thread I want to pull is that you're revisiting your policy. And so I would just offer that that has to be just habit, right? Like a policy with respect to this technology that is expanding in directions we can't even anticipate. And we clearly don't know exactly how it's going to affect the work our students are going to be doing. I mean, it has to be revisited, I think. But with that said, I'm curious, are any of you all are you learning or seeing reaction to how your policy is actually being supplemented in or implemented in the classroom? Do you have any takeaways kind of from the immediate experience you're having? Because this is relatively new for all of us. I mean, this technology hasn't been around for long. So anybody want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I'll start. We had students on our committee, and I think that really helped us hear where they were scared of how a policy might go, especially one that affects so much of their work. So having the students say, but what about this? And what about this? And what about this? Made it a stronger policy that the students then were comfortable. And of course, we linked it to the honor code policy, and our students vote on the honor code policy. So it was nice to have that brought together.
That's great to hear.
Yeah,
Um,
that's really great to
yeah.
hear, and that's encouraging to me also. Because we don't have as much student involvement, frankly, in our committee work at Chicago, and but we do think it's a good idea for exactly the reasons that you gave, and so we're trying to get that rolling. Kat, just to kind of underline something that you mentioned a moment ago, the big kind of realization for me, I guess, that's happened over the last less than 6 months, honestly, is there've been conversations over the last several years at the law school here about having no device policies in the classroom, having closed book exams, more kind of old school approach to the classroom and to evaluation. And in the past, there was when a professor would kind of experiment with a little bit, there was a lot of grumbling, honestly, from students. I mean, there was pushback from students, and faculty were, including myself, understandably reluctant to push too hard because if we weren't so sure it was a great idea, if the students didn't like it, maybe it's not a good idea. What has changed so dramatically in the last 6 months has been that resistance from students appears to have evaporated in my observation. Every time a professor this academic year has said, we're going to have no laptops in the classroom, it's going to be a closed book exam, there's been basically zero pushback from students. And I'll tell you a story. I was at lunch with some students the other day, and I love talking about AI. So AI came up, and we're talking about AI. And one of the students said something that really stuck with me, which was he said, I wish I could have gone to law school before AI was invented.
Hmm.
And it kind of broke my heart, just kind of hearing a student say that, because there was this sort of sense of tragedy, in what he was saying, because I think he feels like his experience is better when it's just him and the books, him and the books, him and his classmates, him and the professor. And but there's always this pull to, like, oh, time pressure. I'm not confident in my own answers. I'm going to turn to AI. I need AI to help. And I think, honestly, what drives a lot of student use of AI, I think, is that sense that, well, if everybody else is using it, if I don't use it, I'll fall behind. I don't think that's true for what it's worth, but I do think it's true that people feel that way. And so I do think that's something that's very different about the current moment than I perceived it to be even 6 months ago.
Yeah, we
Mm,
had students weigh in on our policy as well, and it was interesting because we had student-driven initiatives in our journals, in our law review, in our moot court board, and they were really pushing for policies about using AI for student notes and for like the write-on competition for law review, because same thing, right? They said it's they if everyone's using it, then okay. But if some people are and some people aren't, it's unfair advantage to them. If some people are better because they took the AI course at prompting and getting AI, which I do think we need to teach students how to use these tools and how to use them for efficiency in the real world in practice. But there is a limit, I think, to what you're saying is what we're hearing from our students. They want to do the critical thinking on their own. And if they have this heavy reliance on AI tools that are spitting back answers to things that they should be thinking about themselves, then they're lacking that buildup of critical thinking skills and logic and those legal reasoning abilities that we're teaching in law schools.
Yeah, it really depends on where you put the human in the loop. And I think we have to spend some time helping our students figure out at what point is it important to struggle with the material yourself, and then at what point can you use AI to augment your understanding of something?
So I wonder if we can expect students to know that if we're not giving them AI competency.
You cannot.
Right? If right, like that's not just something that organically springs from one's mind just because you decide to think about it. Um, so well, let's talk about what we're seeing in practice with students. And this has been touched on a little bit, I think, in the conversation so far. I'm struck, William, by the story you tell of a student who, had this longing for going back to the good old days. Well, I graduated from Vanderbilt Law School in 1998, and I can tell you that some of us had periodically laptops in the classroom. Like that was a thing, but not everyone did. And I would say most people didn't. And I had legal writing and research assignments where we were prohibited from using Westlaw or
Mm-hmm.
Lexis. We had to go to the stacks. That doesn't happen anymore. And certainly, most of our conversations, especially in a seminar, were completely devoid of any kind of technology. Um, Clearly, we're in a different world now. Um, our students have gotten to where they are differently than I got to and where I was entering law school. There are a whole lot of different factors. I want to highlight and commend all of you for including students in this conversation. I observe that often students are very well positioned, especially if they have knowledge and experience with these tools and have spent, if you've got a third year student, they've already spent 2 summers probably working in law firms and have a sense of what's going on there. They have a lot of really good information to share and contribute. And so, in some ways, they're expert in things that we're not. And so, I think bringing them into the conversation is really critical. And I'll just point out too, just from a persuasion standpoint, like if you want people to buy into something, the more you involve folks in creating the thing, right? They have some ownership in what's been created, and they're much more likely to follow it because here's the deal, right? A policy is on a piece of paper or in a PDF on a website. Um, but how's it actually being activated, right? What does that look like? And where are we seeing it being activated well? Where is there friction? We had a little bit of conversation about faculty who really want nothing to do with the age of AI. And so essentially going to pretend it's not happening. Um, right? And so there's absolutely no conversation, whether in the syllabus, maybe they have a perfunctory don't use AI, statement in the syllabus, but other than that, there's absolutely zero conversation. And so I'm just curious about what we're seeing when the rubber hits the road and the activation of policies and how that's playing out. Any thoughts on that? I mean, Nancy, you're about to be teaching a required
Yeah.
course to one else, right? So that's activation.
Yeah, it is. And it was in part due to our curriculum committee surveying the students to find out how they were using AI and in what ways they were using AI and which platforms. Joe Regalia and I worried a little bit that not everybody has access to AI. And so we had to make sure that there was some baseline access to Chat GPT and to Claude. And I believe we're getting Harvey this fall as well. And so they'll actually have an equal opportunity to try out these platforms and get used to how to think about when to use them under what circumstances and with what guardrails. And the course that we're doing, we could only eke out 1 credit hour in the fall because we were afraid our students would explode. So 1 credit hour, so that's 13 weeks. We needed a motif to be able to get students AI conversant. And so the motif will start with ethics. Of course, we'll start with ethics. But we're actually going to use contract law, because I teach contracts, to give them a context for how to use it when you want to learn something, when you want to practice something. And we're going to pull in a little bit of torts and a little bit of civ pro so that they're going to have snippets of what lawyers do in real life as a way to apply what they're learning with AI.
That makes sense, giving it context, right? That's
Yeah.
absolutely the best way to learn. So thank you, Nancy. William, any thoughts on this, on the activation of the policy? What's
Yeah,
happening?
so I think one of the things that I would imagine a lot of law schools are I don't want to characterize it as struggling, but working through is the fact that on the one hand there's the need to actively engage with AI, to teach students how to use it, to get students using AI, and there are probably lots of stakeholders, including faculty members who are enthusiastic about that. But there's also probably lots of stakeholders, maybe especially faculty members, who are unenthusiastic about that and who really want to keep AI out of the classroom as much as possible, and how to navigate that. And I think that as we've tried to shift from this focus on, well, we're just going to set a default rule, but let people make up their own minds and do their own thing, to something that's a little bit more coordinated. How do you get that coordination when people have very different views about things? And I think our approach is to be a little bit both and, I guess, is to say, we need to teach students with AI and we need to teach students without AI. And we need to be thoughtful about why we're using AI in some contexts and not other contexts. And I mean, we've already heard from Kat, from you, and from Emily and Nancy, kind of what those parameters are. In practice, students are going to be using AI. So they need to know and have experience and familiarity with the ways they would use AI in practice. On the other hand, law school isn't just about sort of the mechanics of going through the motions of being a lawyer. It's how to think like a lawyer, and how to be critical and a deep thinker about the tough questions you're going to face in practice. And that doesn't necessarily need AI, and in some contexts might be better absolutely without AI. And so I think where we're starting to move, and we're very early in this conversation, but is thinking about having some classrooms where, yeah, there's no devices at all. Forget about AI. There's no laptops. On the other hand, there are classes where the whole point of the class is AI, and how do you use it in a practice, in a realistic practice like simulation or experiential environment, kind of to what Nancy was saying about the 1L curriculum. We've broken up the 1L legal research and writing into kind of two segments, where the first segment, there's no AI, there's even no Westlaw or Lexis for that matter. But then the second segment, you can kind of use whatever tools you see fit. And I think that's a good starting point. But what we really need to work on and make sure we're doing right is that last piece that that Kat and Nancy, you were talking about, which is the judgment about when and how to use AI. The mechanics of actually prompt engineering, I think students can figure that out on their own. But that judgment about, I know well enough how to review this AI product that I'm going to use AI to speed myself up, versus, you know what, I need to do this the hard way the first time because I don't actually know yet. I think that judgment is an important thing to cultivate, and it's very much a work in progress, but I think that's the goal.
Excellent. All right, Emily, and I've got something I'm going to circle back around to, but Emily, you go. What you got? How's the activation going? What's that looking like?
Yeah, activation has been interesting. Many of our faculty have adopted a policy where students can use AI in, research and formatting. We have actually changed our legal writing and legal research curriculum to separate them, and now we have a legal writing course and a legal analysis and research course that will have AI as part of the AI competency, as part of the class, and it's 3 credits in their first semester. So I think it's going to be a substantial opportunity for that competence in AI that Nancy's talking about in her 1L class with 1 credit, right? Yeah. Because of course AI is prevalent in legal research. We can't say it's not. What we found really interesting when faculty would put AI policies in their course syllabi was students coming to my dean of students or my academic dean and saying, well, I use AI every day, all day, in my Google searches, in my Netflix, in my Amazon. We all do, right? So, sort of understanding that AI is embedded in technology and how we use it. And so they were kind of telling on themselves, not that it was an academic dishonesty, but
Mhm.
how do I navigate whether or not I'm using AI when sometimes you don't even know you're using it? So we've
Yeah.
had interesting conversations with the student body, with the Student Bar Association about the just teaching AI competence. And then we have it all the way up to the third year where our AI and tech classes are full. We have such high demand for the IP and the AI and tech. And then we have a professor who has created an entire client universe in Claude that simulates, a clinic basically.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's yeah, I want to take the class, but
Yeah.
he limits it because only he can only handle 20
Mm.
students in that type of a
Yep.
class. So there's a lot of demand, I think, from the student body to just understand.
Oh, there absolutely is. So, to your point, Emily, yes, every course we roll out through the lab is full with a full waiting list, right? So we feel like we could clone ourselves virtually and still not meet the demand. And I don't think that's unique to our student body at all. And that, from what you're saying, clearly not. I just want to point out, as I listen to all of you talk, I think we have this meaningful opportunity to really model for our students what it means to exercise discernment when it comes to the use
Mhm.
of AI based on the choices we make for our schools and as faculty, right? Because that's what we're talking about. We're having to exercise discernment and carving out what are we carving out that is not about AI, is about a learning experience that it needs to happen in a very different way. And we're not going to let this be impacted by the technology, but recognizing there are all these other reasons why we need to be addressing it in different ways. Like that's exercising discernment. And I use the word discernment instead of judgment. Judgment is kind of the activation of judgment is the activation of discernment, but I'll just offer really quickly. We operate from a model of AI competency kind of in three parts. One is literacy, and that is understanding how the technology works and just the technical understanding. There is fluency, that's understanding how the tools work, how to use them, when to use them, where to use them. And then the top layer is discernment. And that has a whole bunch of different elements that are, I think, in many ways unique to lawyers because we have obligations, the ethical obligations that differ. They're what make us different from other knowledge workers and other professionals. And so I think this offers us an opportunity across the curriculum to think about how we are shaping our students' development across all three of those pieces, right? Because it's not a uniform thing. There are a couple of questions that have been raised in the chat that I just want to call some attention to. I think you all have talked about how you're approaching AI in one year, especially writing and research, and I think that's a critical place. Our writing and research program first year also addresses it and carves out space before we talk about it, all that kind of stuff. Um, there was a question specifically for you, Nancy, and Rick Simmons asked, are you teaching all of your 1Ls in one large class or are you breaking them up into sections? And he just notes that they're struggling with finding enough professors available to teach multiple sections
Yeah.
of a 1L AI class, but worry about doing it as like one large group.
So it's challenging. Joe Regalia and I are co-teaching. We each have a section, but we're agreeing on the syllabus so that the students in both sections they're getting different perspectives, but they're getting basically the same work. The challenge has not been our day students. So Joe and I will each have about 60, 65 students. But in the evening students, it's going to take us one extra cycle to
Mm.
get to them. So we have to figure out how to work in our evening students as well. The other thing for me is that I'm now figuring out how do I teach it in PR? How do I teach it in other classes so that I give students a chance to experience the responsible use of AI in everything they do that I connect with them on. So I will be spending part of the summer writing about how law schools will change with the advent of AI and
Mm.
part of it actually changing my darn courses. Oh, one other thing about the course. We wanted to make sure that students took it seriously, not that they wouldn't. It's graded. It's not curved, but it's
Mhm.
graded.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's always, we could have an hour conversation on that topic alone. Always, yeah, thinking about that versus pass
Yeah.
fail,
Yeah.
constant question we face with our lab courses. Well, let's shift into a thoughtful conversation focused on where our students are going
Mhm.
and maybe digging in a little bit deeper about what we need to be doing. We've talked about that in a couple of limited ways, but I'd like to dig into this a little bit more. So, I think we can just look and agree, I think, that by every measure that AI adoption and practice is ramping up a lot more rapidly than AI literacy, competency, and legal education, right? It's just moving surprisingly fast for those of us who's been studying the legal industry for the past 30 years, I will say. And I will quote the ABA task force in their last report. They stated, adoption has surpassed understanding. And
Mhm.
this really does go back to, right, literacy, fluency, because we can have a perceived fluency without the necessary literacy and definitely without exercising discernment, right? That fluency piece is actually very scary if we consider it all by itself. And policies really aren't saving people. And so, you know, to me, this starts with thinking about what is our duty to students to prepare them going into this world of the practice of law in the age of AI when we still really don't know where it's going. I mean, if you go on LinkedIn and read some of the posts, you will think that half of the law firms now are, quote, AI native and are populated more by agents doing things in the direction of one person than humans doing things. Now, we know that's not the case, but there's a lot of interesting experimentation going on, right? And so I think we are glimpsing into future possibilities of where the
Mhm.
practice is going to go. Um, so I'm curious if you all have a sense, one, of what employers are signaling back to law schools about what their expectations are. What is that conversation, if any, looking like? I think that's a source of input we might seek as we're thinking about how we prepare students. Um, and really thinking a little bit more concretely about that gap between what we're teaching them and what they're walking into. Um, yeah.
I, I gave a talk at the University of Denver earlier this year to a bunch of very sad law students who were trying to figure out what was going to happen to their careers when they graduated. And I said, you've got to have the kinds of skills to make you more valuable than a Harvey seat license. Harvey does certain things. We teach more than that in law school, and we teach judgment and reading the room and strategic thinking that at this point you can't get from AI models. That'll change, but right now there are things that humans bring to the table that computers can't yet. And I the argument that Joe and I made when we were pitching our course was not giving students an understanding of how AI fits into lawyering is educational malpractice.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that that's true. So my career services dean and I do sort of a tour of firms in our area that our students are going to work for. We meet with the managing partners. We ask them how our graduates are doing. We just want to know, what could we be doing better to prepare them? And we have talked about AI, and I think the trend that we're hearing is that students need to have the basic knowledge of AI, the terminology, the ethical use. So, are there the Supreme Court? Our Supreme Court has a whole resource guide on artificial intelligence, and they just released an Ohio ethics guide for AI. So, just that basic understanding, and then also the understanding that it does unlock efficiency in practice. So, they should know how to use the tools that are available, and that's something we struggle with. We have Westlaw and Lexis. We have all of these legal tools that we're supposed to be teaching students, but how do we choose, right? Claude, Harvey, Gemini, whatever we choose, right? And how do we have all of these license agreements with Clio and Relativity and, West and Lexis? And where do we draw the line? Because we're hearing from the firms, they want them to know how to use these tools. And then the other thing we're hearing is that they want to train new associates and have us give them some guidance on how to educate their clients on the use of AI.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of open questions from clients about, well, why am I paying an attorney to do this when Harvey could just do it for me, right? So that's what we're hearing.
Thank you, Emily. William.
Yeah, same story here. I guess I'll just add a couple of thoughts. Yeah, every time I meet with alums, or the dean meets with alums, AI comes up. I mean, this is something that's very much front of mind for so many people in the profession. So I'll offer a couple of additional thoughts that kind of supplement everything that's been said, which I agree with. So one is, I think there's a lot of heterogeneity across different employers in terms of what tools will be available to them and how much they'll be able to use AI. On one end, you have uh, our grads are going into some organizations or clerkships where they can't use AI. Other grads are going to firms, especially where they're very much expected to use AI. The lawyers might have marching orders from their clients that they have to use AI, and there may not be a lot of guidance, frankly, from the senior lawyers about how junior lawyers are supposed to use AI, and they're expecting law schools to kind of fill in that gap, and that's the discernment angle, I think, that Kat, you were talking about, and the importance of developing that discernment set of skills at law schools, because you might not be getting it in your first placement in practice. So just preparing students to have the comfort level of working with and without AI, so that wherever they land, they're going to be comfortable in that position. And then the other thing that I'll say, that I've been kind of distilling from my conversations with alums and with people in practice is the way that I used to think about a mid-level associate when I was in practice many years ago now is how I think law firms want junior associates to be approaching their jobs. Is they're no longer the person writing the first draft. They are the person who is marking up the first draft and making judgments about where that draft should go, because the first drafts in many cases are being written by AI bots rather than by associates. And if that's the case, then it's a different set of skills that a person is, as a graduate of a law school, expected to already have developed while in law school, rather than figuring out through trial and error in their first few years of practice. And again, that kind of puts an onus on law schools to think about how they can make sure they expose students to enough of that experience, that iterative experience of writing, that I think a lot of our graduates are going to be called upon to do in different settings.
William, you raise a really good point, and this is what scares me, because we can only do so much in law school. And it takes people around 3 years after law school to understand truly what it means to be a lawyer. And when all of us on this webinar, including the audience, gets output from AI, we can tell wheat from chaff. We're senior enough and we're experienced enough to do it. But junior lawyers, they don't have the knowledge base to actually know when they're getting bad output and then editing bad output. And so what really worries me is that transition period from junior to mid-level. And I don't have a good answer for that. I really don't.
So I think we're going to have to experiment to find
Yeah.
answers that are good to that. But I think you've all tapped into something that I think is worth calling out, and that is understanding what the potential challenges are, really naming those concerns based on what we know now, and trying to build back from that, right? If we know that it's a problem right now, to assume a law student who hasn't developed the discernment that an experienced lawyer has, to assume they don't have that discernment and therefore are not going to be prepared to be that really effective human in the loop, right? They're not going to walk out of law school prepared to be the mid-level associate reviewing something because that mid-level associate has had time to practice and learn from mistakes and get feedback and learn. And I'll tell you, I talk to folks in law firms constantly. This is a very big concern. I think we have a common concern, and I think this is where there's really an opportunity for there to be perhaps more concerted coordination between the places where our students are going and the choices law schools are making with respect to integrating the technology into the curriculum. And I think we've all touched on the fact that this is not about changing everything about legal education because of the thing we were just talking about, discernment, right?
Mhm.
We know that there's a lot about how we teach lawyers now and how we train them that really works, right? We are preparing students to enter the practice with a core skill set. And so we have this thing that is now, it's and. It's not or, it's not but, it's and. And I'll just refer back to a vignette I shared with all of you before we came live on the webinar. I was speaking to the Ohio Women Bar Association, and a lot of the conversation was about what do we, the women in this room, the hundreds of women in this room who are practicing, their judges, their in-house counsel, what do we need to be doing to understand this technology, to use it? They are asking themselves the same exact questions that our students are asking themselves, that we're asking about our students. And so the question was posed near the end, how do I do this? Like, how do I, and my honest answer was, I don't know. Just what you said, Nancy. I don't know. Um, because it feels like an and, not an or. So I, coming from human-centered design, I want to put every challenge is an opportunity, right? The other thing we know is there is a lot about legal education that's not perfect, that could be better, right? We could always do a better job of preparing our students to go forth and be the amazing lawyers that we hope they will be. And so, how we look at this too is an opportunity to change in ways that lifts everything up. And I really think it does come back to policy. Like, right, what is the faculty rallying around? What are folks deciding? We agree on this, we support this, and then how are we activating that? Um, I will share briefly that, and I don't know that I gave the information to Jim to share this out in the chat, but I recently developed a framework for individual faculty members to use to work through how they wanted to approach AI in their class, in their individual course, right? Because as we've noted, policy really gives power primarily back to the individual faculty member to decide. And I think it is course by course what you're teaching. It's not a uniform across everything decision. It's called chaos. And so I will be glad to get that to Jim. Maybe I can try to find it while someone else is chiming in, and I could give it to Jim to share out to everyone. But if you were going to give some advice to folks who might be a little earlier in this journey than you all are with your faculty in your schools, what would be a first piece of advice that you might give as a school as they're approaching how they're going to design policy and activate it? Emily, we'll start with you.
I think my advice would be to educate the faculty first on AI and competency. We went into writing this AI policy, and a lot of faculty said, "I'll be honest with you, I've never used it. I don't know anything about it. I don't even know what you're talking about, what this generative AI is." And so there were levels of knowledge just on the faculty. So having the student perspective too is something that I would encourage. So educating the faculty and getting students involved.
Nancy, what about you?
I think that's an absolute must, Emily, no question about it. I also think that deans although they have limited budgets and there's only so much they can do. I've been a dean, I know. Finding incentives to get people to experiment with AI, and they don't have to be monetary incentives. People respond to a variety of different incentives. And I was thinking, what would be some good incentives that don't cost deans money? Some of it is extra release time to actually spend time with this, but that still costs resources. So there have to be things that are low cost but effective. Lunchtime conversations with high users, talking to people who are just dabbling to share ideas is one way. But I think incentives to the faculty to get them willing to dip a toe in would be really nice.
+1 on both of those suggestions. William.
Yeah, so totally agree with all of that. I guess what I would do is let me just kind of tag on to Kat something you said about policies, but also activating the policies. And here's I guess what I would say, and maybe this is responsive to some of the questions and in the chat and the Q&A also is. I think over the past few years, one approach that people have taken as they frame these questions is, well, should we prohibit AI or should we encourage AI? And I would say that's not a dichotomy that you want to pursue. Another thing is, well, we need to figure out what counts as generative AI and what counts as not generative AI. Again, I don't think that's a dichotomy that's worth pursuing, partly because at this point, generative AI is so integrated into so many of the tools that we use, is that drawing that line, I think, is going to become increasingly a hopeless effort, frankly. And so where does that leave us? I think what my advice that I would give to somebody who's early in this process is, we've all talked about the policies that we implemented and default rules and so on, and I think that's fine. But ultimately, I think the most important way to think about this isn't in terms of what should the policy say, but rather how should we design the way that we teach? Because my view and what I'm pushing in my own faculty, and we're having this conversation right now, is I don't think investing in academic integrity policies and AI detection software and stuff like that is going to work. I think that's just going down the wrong path. I think what we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, this is a moment to reevaluate the way that we teach and to ask ourselves, if the way that we teach requires us to be looking over the students' shoulders in order to determine whether or not they used AI, maybe that's the wrong way to teach. And instead, we should redesign the way that we teach to, on the one hand, enable students to be good at using AI. But on the other hand, when we really want them thinking for themselves and not using AI as a crutch, how can we design our teaching so that we just steer them away from AI? We don't have to police them and surveil them and monitor their usage. And I think that requires being creative and saying, okay, maybe we need to have more classroom discussion. Maybe when you turn in a paper, instead of us doing an AI check on the paper, we're going to require you to present the paper briefly in class and have a little bit of Q&A about the paper, and to just be more a little bit more creative and a little bit more willing to challenge ourselves to be better teachers and to use this moment as an opportunity for that.
I'm into that. And I would say that is scary, but it also is really exciting. So I think, again, opportunity, shifting that challenge into an opportunity. It is an incredible opportunity to do all the things that we've just talked about. Well, we are seconds away from the hour. So I think that we timed this impeccably. Thank you all so very much for engaging in this conversation. It was as much fun as I thought it would be. Jim did toss a link to my Substack post about the chaos method into the chat for anyone who is interested. Thanks so much. And I think he's also sharing how to find us. So reach out. I'm happy to chat and engage. And thanks again, y'all. I really appreciate it.